There are moments in history that don't announce themselves with fanfare. They arrive quietly, through a sealed envelope, a whispered conversation, a hand placed on the edge of a desk, not for ceremony, not for strength, but because the weight of an entire reign had suddenly become too much to hold alone. This is the story of one of those moments. The moment a king let go. The moment a son had to catch what fell. And the moment one woman, one princess, said the words out loud that everyone else inside the palace had been too afraid to speak. The crown transfers. For months, the question had been circling the monarchy like a storm that never quite broke. The whispers were everywhere, in palace corridors, in private briefing rooms, in the careful pauses between official statements. King Charles had been battling cancer. That much the world already knew. But what the world didn't know, what the palace had guarded with extraordinary care, was far more significant. Royal insiders close to the situation began to say something that no one inside Buckingham Palace wanted to confirm. That the cancer was not going to relent. That Charles would likely live with it, not recover from it. And that the monarchy, an institution that had stood for over 1,000 years, could no longer afford to operate in uncertainty. Something had to happen. Someone had to say the word. And that word was abdication. Abdication, for those unfamiliar with the term, is the formal act of a monarch voluntarily giving up the throne before death. It ends one reign so another can begin. It is rare. It is painful. And in British royal history it carries the weight of crisis. The last time it happened, 1936, it nearly destroyed the institution entirely. And yet here, in the quiet rooms of a modern palace, it was already underway. The abdication process was complete. And the person who confirmed it, not a courtier, not a prime minister, not a palace press secretary, was Princess Anne, the Princess Royal herself. To understand why Anne's confirmation shook the monarchy to its foundation, you have to understand who Anne is within the royal family. She is not a woman who speaks unless the moment demands it. She is not a woman who deals in sentiment when duty is available. She has spent decades as the hardest-working member of the royal family, steady, disciplined, private, carrying out her responsibilities without complaint, without drama, without the kind of headline-grabbing behavior that surrounded so many others in the House of Windsor. When Anne speaks officially, people listen, not because she is loud, but because she is almost never wrong. And so when the Princess Royal prepared a recorded private statement, the kind used when the palace needs every word preserved, every pause documented, and every denial made impossible, the senior royal officials who received it knew exactly what it meant. This was not a rumor being managed. This was history being sealed. The statement confirmed that the abdication process was complete. That William, the Prince of Wales, was preparing to step forward as the new force at the center of the crown. That one sentence changed everything. Charles received the confirmation in silence. He was standing near his desk, a desk that had hosted weeks of sealed family consultations, private meetings, and communications so tightly controlled that even senior aides had been kept at arm's length. He placed one hand on the edge of the wood, not for ceremony, not for strength, but because the sentence had made history suddenly feel very, very heavy. Charles had spent an entire lifetime moving toward the throne. He was the longest-serving heir apparent in the history of the British monarchy, waiting for over 70 years for his moment to arrive. And now duty, the same duty that had defined him, shaped him, and sometimes consumed him, was asking him to do the one thing no amount of preparation could make painless. Let go. Across the palace, William heard the same confirmation, and did not smile. That detail matters. A lesser account of this story might expect triumph from the heir who is about to become king. But what those closest to William describe is something entirely different. The prince lowered his head, as if the sentence had landed in his chest before his mind could fully process it. He was not stepping over his father. He understood that with painful clarity. He was stepping into the wound his father had left behind. Catherine was nearby, and when William's carefully controlled expression faltered, just for one small second, just enough for those watching closely to notice, She reached for his hand before anyone else in the room could react. She knew why that mattered. If he broke too openly, the household would feel it, and fear would travel faster than any official statement. If he hardened too much, the country would feel that too, and the new reign would begin in coldness rather than strength. Catherine had always understood the emotional architecture of monarchy better than most. She knew that a future king's private grief, if left unmanaged, becomes a public vulnerability, and she had no intention of letting that happen. Meanwhile, a detail so small it might have been missed told Camilla everything she needed to know. A senior aide quietly removed one chair from the council room layout. Just one chair. But in a palace where every arrangement carries meaning, that small act said what no formal announcement had yet confirmed. The household around Charles was already changing direction. Camilla, the queen consort, the woman who had stood beside Charles through the most turbulent chapters of his personal life, felt the shift before anyone named it. Her place beside him remained personal, deeply so, but the machinery of power was already turning toward William, and Charles, by all accounts, seemed too exhausted to defend what was already slipping quietly away. But the abdication did not begin with Anne's statement. To understand the true turning point, the moment that made everything that followed inevitable, you have to go back to a private meeting that the palace tried very hard to keep buried. A succession briefing, held behind closed doors at Windsor. A succession briefing, for context, is a private royal meeting designed to prepare the household for the transition of authority, to answer the questions no one wants to ask out loud, to establish, in calm and careful language, who will hold power and how it will move. This one was supposed to do exactly that. Instead, it cracked the family open. Charles entered that room trying to hold everything together. He was fully aware of the pressure building around him, from his declining health, from the strain threading through his relationships with William and Catherine, from the growing murmur of public uncertainty about the monarchy's direction. He sat down. He looked at the papers in front of him. Emergency leadership transfer documents, formal instruments designed to move key royal authority quickly during a period of crisis. They required a signature. His signature. Charles reached for the pen. And then he stopped. He looked away. That pause, that single unguarded hesitation, changed everything in the room. Because William was watching. The prince did not raise his voice. That silence, those who were present would later say, made it worse. William stood across the table and asked his father, directly and without softness, whether the delay was about duty or fear. The words cut through the air like something physical. Charles's face tightened. Not from anger alone, but from something more complicated and more painful than anger. He had been seen, fully seen, by his own son. William stepped back slightly. A small movement, barely noticeable to anyone who wasn't watching for it. But Anne, seated nearby, caught it immediately. She understood what it meant. The future king had finally understood that waiting had its own cost. That hesitation at the very top didn't protect anyone. It only postponed the moment when clarity became unavoidable, and did not interrupt them. She watched Charles with the grief of a sister. She watched William with the alarm of someone who understood exactly where this was heading. Later, through a documented private account prepared for the family record, and wrote that the crown could no longer operate in uncertainty. Because uncertainty at the very top doesn't stay contained. It spreads through aides, through schedules, through press briefings, through the quiet behavior of every household official who watches carefully to understand which way the wind is blowing. Uncertainty becomes its own kind of crisis. And Catherine, who learned about the Windsor briefing that same night, responded in a way that Anne would later describe as quietly decisive. She didn't panic. She didn't ask how to protect herself or her children, or her carefully constructed private life. She asked what William would need to carry the burden ahead. That answer changed Anne's assessment of the next reign entirely. The Princess Royal had spent decades studying strength under pressure. And what Catherine showed her that night, that quiet, immediate, unselfish readiness, told in something that no amount of formal preparation ever could. The next reign would not stand on William alone. It would stand on what stood beside him. after and issued her warning to Charles that further delay would damage the crown more than the abdication itself. There was only one thing left to do. Father and son had to face each other, not as king and heir, as men. The meeting was private. No aides. No courtiers softening the language. No carefully worded palace briefings to hide behind. Just Charles and William in a closed room, with everything unsaid between them finally demanding to be spoken. William entered without notes. Charles had agreed to the meeting because Anne's warning had cut through every instinct he had to delay, deflect, and defer. The king looked at his son and said something that those closest to both men have never fully forgotten. He said that no one is ever truly ready to inherit the loneliness of the throne. The throne, not just a chair, not just a symbol, but the entire weight of sovereign responsibility, the nation's trust, the institution's future, the sacrifice of private life for public duty. That throne had always demanded more than comfort. It demanded surrender. William placed his hand on the back of a chair but did not sit. That gesture said everything. He was still a son, respectful, aware of what this moment cost his father. But he was also the future king, and the future could no longer wait in the hallway. The prince told Charles plainly, the country could not wait for perfect readiness. Not when the palace had already begun reorganizing itself around a decision that everyone could feel, but no one had yet been allowed to name out loud. Charles absorbed the words slowly. The silence between them stretched and settled like something old and heavy. And then the king said what Anne had already forced into the open weeks before. She was right. The institution needed one clear voice, one direction, one set of hands on the wheel. The abdication was complete. The king did not say it with relief. He said it the way a man speaks when he is finally releasing something he has gripped for so long that letting go feels like a small, quiet death. And William stood there knowing that his father's ending had become his beginning. Then Charles made one request, not a demand, not a command, a request from a father to a son. He asked William to promise him that saving the crown would not destroy the family. The prince did not answer quickly, because that promise was heavier than any signature. He knew what it meant for Camilla, who would feel the shift in power like a door closing softly in her face. He knew what it meant for Catherine, who would carry the strain of a new reign beside him, quietly, without complaint. He knew what it had already cost and who had become the voice of finality so that no one else would have to be. But he looked at his father and promised. Firmness would not become cruelty. That was the moment the confrontation changed. Charles stopped fighting the future. William stopped waiting for permission to enter it. Power in a palace rarely moves with noise. It moves through small gestures. A changed briefing order. A redirected phone call. A private secretary standing outside a different door than the one they stood outside yesterday. After Anne's confirmation, the machinery of the monarchy began turning toward William with cold, efficient precision. Transition briefings, private updates explaining how power, duties, and decisions move from one royal leader to the next, began arriving under William's name before the family had even fully processed what was happening. Household authority schedules moved away from Charles's final review. A senior courtier delivered the first official schedule under William's authority with careful, ceremonial silence. And what was missing from that document said more than anything it contained. Charles's final sign-off line was gone. The absence spoke louder than any announcement. Catherine's name appeared beside William's in the private planning notes. Not as decoration, not as a ceremonial gesture, but as a recognition, from the machinery of monarchy itself, that the steadiness of the next reign would depend on her as much as on him. She understood the weight of that recognition. If William's reign began with pressure, grief, and fracture, discipline alone would not hold it together. Camilla, meanwhile, declined an early meeting when the invitation arrived. She chose silence. She understood that confrontation would not serve her, and that the palace was reorganizing itself around William in ways that no amount of personal loyalty to Charles could fully counteract. Her silence was not peace. It was resistance held very carefully behind closed lips. The woman who had stood beside Charles through every storm of his personal life was watching the household shift around her. And she was beginning to understand the difference between being loved by a man and being central to a reign. Those are two very different things. And by the morning after Anne's confirmation, one door had closed, and another had not yet opened. There are moments when history becomes too heavy for ceremony. Before William faced the palace, before he faced the nation, before every public word he spoke would carry the force of a new reign, Catherine found him alone. No aides, no cameras, no shield of formal language between them. The prince was not speaking like a future king in that room. He was speaking like a husband who understood that life had shifted into something permanent and irreversible. He told her something that his public composure had never allowed him to say in any briefing room, any palace corridor, any moment where someone else might hear and misunderstand. He never wanted the throne to arrive through his father's pain. He never wanted Charles's surrender to become his beginning. William spoke, in that room, like the sun inside him had finally broken through the future king. Catherine answered with the calm he needed most. Duty rarely comes gently, she told him, and leadership is not about replacing Charles. It is about carrying forward what must survive. The prince admitted the fear that had been sitting beneath every controlled sentence for weeks. He worried the family would fracture under the transition. He worried that Camilla would feel isolated, pushed from the center of a life she had spent decades building beside Charles. He worried that his father would feel erased, reduced to a closed chapter before his wounds had even settled. He worried that the monarchy could look stable on the outside while quietly breaking from within. Catherine did not let him disappear into that fear. She reminded him that firmness did not have to become cruelty, that the next monarchy could be disciplined without being cold, clear without being heartless, strong without humiliating those who had stepped back. She gave shape to the reign he was about to command, not with grand speeches, not with political calculation, but with the kind of truth that only someone who loves you without condition can speak. William listened because Catherine was not speaking to the crown. She was speaking to the man beneath it, and something in the room changed. Not lighter. He was not lighter, but steadier. Catherine had not removed the burden. No one could. But she had reminded him that his first act of leadership did not have to be conquest. Could be control. Could be mercy. It could be duty with a human face. When the news reached the public, it did not feel like palace gossip. It felt like history breaking through the front door. The palace released its controlled confirmation after Anne's statement, a carefully worded official message designed to present one clear, unified version of a moment that was, in truth, deeply fractured. That message confirmed the abdication process was complete. William was entering active leadership. Not someday, not eventually, now. Broadcasters treated the moment with the kind of seriousness usually reserved for national crisis. One morning presenter described it as the most dramatic royal transition in a generation. Outside Buckingham Palace, crowds gathered without the usual noise. Some held flags. Some stood with their phones lowered. Others simply stared at the gates as if waiting for the building itself to explain what had just happened. The silence was not emptiness. It was grief wearing the mask of patience. One woman near the front, speaking into a broadcaster's microphone with tears on her face, said what the palace's official language could not. Charles had waited all his life, and the crown had asked him to let go before he was ready. A major newspaper front page carried a headline that struck differently than triumph. William steps forward, beside a photograph of the palace gates at dawn. It did not sound like victory. It sounded like burden, and it was. In the end, what happened inside those palace walls was not simply a constitutional event, though it was that too. A constitutional event of the highest order. The kind that reshapes authority, rewrites history, and forces an entire nation to confront the humanity beneath the institution it has trusted for centuries. But beyond the papers and procedures and recorded statements, what truly happened was a human surrender. Charles gave up the role he had waited a lifetime to hold. And he did it not because he was forced, but because duty asked him to place the institution above himself one final time. William accepted a burden he had never chased, delivered through grief rather than celebration. And he did it because the alternative was chaos, and he loved his country and his family too much to let chaos win. And spoke the words no one else would say. Not to wound her brother, not to elevate her nephew, but because she understood that an institution built on clarity cannot survive indefinitely on silence. Catherine stood beside the storm with a steadiness that cannot be manufactured, cannot be performed, and cannot be taught. And Camilla, so often misunderstood, so rarely credited with the strength her position demands, sat in the changing silence and felt what it means when the life you built around someone powerful begins to reorganize itself without you at the center. The monarchy did not escape pain. It found direction through it. The crown moved forward not because everyone was healed, but because everyone finally understood what had been asked of them. Charles's long climb ended in sacrifice. William's defining chapter began in grief. Anne's courage turned silence into clarity, and Catherine's steadiness gave the next era its heart. There is a particular kind of courage that doesn't get statues built in its honor. It is the courage of letting go, of stepping back from the life you worked for, not because you failed, but because someone you love needs the space to step forward. That is the courage Charles showed in that room. And it is, perhaps, the bravest thing a king has ever done. The crown did not pass between father and son because one man was ready and another was not. It passed because love, real love, the kind bound in duty and sacrifice and the long silence between two men who understand each other too well, eventually has to make a choice. Charles chose the institution. William chose his father's legacy. And somewhere between those two choices, the monarchy found its future. For those left behind, and for those who must now carry forward, history asks only one thing. Keep going.